Good afternoon, everyone. The Consulate-General of the Netherlands in Chicago, TAPS, Expandify, and International Management Solutions are delighted to welcome you to this webinar, Operating Your U.S. Midwest Business in 2021. First, I'm going to quickly go over some practical and technical guidelines. So all attendees will be muted and the cameras will be turned off, and there is no chat function available. But there is a Q&A function, and we encourage you to use it if you have any questions for any of our speakers today. And we will address all of these questions at the end of today's program. Today's program includes introductions and presentations by the Consul-General of the Netherlands, Mr. Bart Twaalfhoven, EMS Client Manager Benelux Ben Troch, TAPS founder and president Jacob Willemsen, and Expandify's Chief Expansion Officer Sophie Bouteligier. And after the presentations, it's time for testimonials of Benelux businesses that expanded to the Midwest. So, and after that panel discussion, we have, of course, enough time for Q&As. So, yeah, I think it's time to go over to hand it over to Mr. Bart Twaalfhoven, our Consul General.
Thank you very much, Leentje, and indeed, good afternoon to all those in the Netherlands and Belgium, and good morning to the ones here already in the Midwest in Chicago. I'm the Consul General of the Netherlands in Chicago, and being so, I'm the main representative of the Dutch government in the Midwest. Our main task here is to protect and foster the Dutch interest, and therefore I'm very pleased to see so many participants from the Netherlands and also from Belgium who, by participating, indicate their wish to either start up or to expand their business in the Midwest. Andrea, next slide, please. Supporting and protecting the Dutch interest, we are not doing alone here in the Midwest, of course. In the United States, we are part of a big network. In the first place, we do have our embassy in Washington, D.C. And apart from that, we do have professional consulates in Chicago, Miami, New York, San Francisco, and Atlanta. Apart from that, we do have business support offices in Houston and Los Angeles. And for those who are planning to invest from the United States to the Netherlands, we do have the Netherlands Foreign Investment Agency located in the cities of Atlanta, Boston, Chicago, New York, San Francisco, and Washington, D.C. We are being supported in our work by 27 honorary consuls, out of which 6 are located in the Midwest. And the area of the Midwest we can see in our next slide. That is a big part of the United States, containing 13 states ranging from North Dakota via Kansas to Kentucky and up to Michigan. And as you can see, and that is one of the reasons why to go to the Midwest, is that it is very centrally located, not only from the east to the west coast, but throughout the whole Northern American hinterland, including, of course, Canada. The other assets of the Midwest are, in the first place, of course, the business culture. It is a very down-to-earth business culture, very comparable to the Netherlands. Although, of course, there are certain do and don'ts, and for that, we happily coach you and advise you whenever you decide to come this way. Maybe even more importantly, of course, it is that you can make use of an abundance of very well-educated and highly qualified talent. Out of the 25 globally top universities, 3 of them are located here in the Midwest. And the effect on the quality of the workforce is absolutely noticeable. Then these are very good reasons, not only for foreign companies to be here, but also for American companies. And when you look at the number of Fortune 500 headquarters, many of them are located in this area. And especially for the Dutch, I can tell you that the cost of doing business in this area of the United States is absolutely better than on the East or the West Coast. So there are many, many good reasons to come to this part of the United States. When we talk about opportunities, next slide, Andrea, then a number of opportunities are being linked immediately to the Dutch strength and priorities, especially in the top sectors. So indeed, we do see a lot of possibilities in the food and agriculture sector, especially when we look at the food production, at the plant-based protein sector, and at the supply chain. Furthermore, we do see opportunities in the medical technology sector. And opposite to other options in the United States, here in the Midwest, we do say the right place for commercialization and scaling up. It is a highly important sector. And thirdly, we will specifically focus also on advanced manufacturing and automotive. But apart from these three sectors, which are predominantly focusing on also the wishes of the top sectors in the Netherlands, there is, of course, a number of other sectors that we cover. We fortunately have in the office widely experienced and qualified staff who can help the Dutch enterprises out. Next slide, please. Unfortunately, of course, we are all impacted by COVID-19, as everywhere in the world. And we have seen an enormous amount of layoff here in the United States. But I do have to tell you that in my contacts to the Dutch enterprise here located in the Midwest, the experience is that the Dutch companies did do very or relatively well, and some of them indeed very well during the last year. The Dutch showed that they were still able to adapt, that they were flexible, and that they found new alliances and innovative solutions for the challenges that COVID brought them. Next slide, please. So whenever you are really considering going to the Midwest, I would advise you and I would welcome you in our consulate in Chicago. What can we do? We can bring you in contact with all the connections that we have in our network. And I explained the network in the United States, but we do have the same solid network in the Netherlands, of course. We can help you out with inquiries and give you informations. We can include you in missions and events that are being organized throughout the Midwest. And in general, of course, we can see if we can link you to specific companies, sectors, and branches that you are looking for. For those in the Netherlands, they also can make use of the very broad financial support programs of the Dutch government for companies who are willing to go overseas and to help you out with market scans. Last slide. I invite you to come up to us with your questions. Whenever you come to the Midwest, please pass by at the consulate. Maybe we can help you. Maybe we can give you the right directions. And for now, I do thank you for your attention, and I do wish you a very good consideration in which direction you are going. And by saying so, I would like to give the floor to Ben Troch, the client manager Benelux at International Management Solutions, and one of the co-organizers of this seminar. Ben.
Thank you very much for the introduction. If everything is going well, my presentation should show up now. Good afternoon or good morning for the ones that are in the US. My name is Ben Troch. I work at International Management Solutions as client manager for the Benelux. And today I'm going to talk about the individual tax implications and the individual tax system in the US. To start, who are we? So IMS is a US accounting, tax and consulting firm, and we mainly assist European companies setting up in the US. We can assist, amongst others, with the tax structuring of a US entity, corporate income tax, sales and use tax, and also individual taxation. Apart from that, we also have a sister company called IAS, which is a CPA firm that can assist with acquisitions, due diligence, and audit. So as Bart said, I think all of us are impacted by COVID-19, and it might especially be the case for persons that either moved to the US or were planning to move to the US. Some of you might have returned earlier back to the home country than expected. Others might have been forced to stay longer in the US because of travel restrictions, and there might be some that unfortunately postponed their US assignment and can hopefully move to the US later this year. And that could all have an impact on the US tax filing obligations. So that's why I'm going to give a brief overview of what needs to be taken into account on the US individual tax side. To start, the starting point to determine what the US tax filing obligations are is to determine whether you're considered a US resident alien or a US non-resident alien for tax purposes. And there are two tests for non-US citizen to be considered a US resident alien. It's either the green card test or the substantial presence test. The green card test refers to lawful permanent residents of the US that have been issued a green card. For the other one, the substantial presence test, that looks at physical presence in the US. And to calculate the substantial presence test, you need to take into account, you need to be at least 31 days during the current year in the US and 183 days during a 3-year period, whereby all the days in the current year are included, 1/3 of the days in the year before the current year, and 1/6 of the days in the second year before the current year. So on average, if you spend 120 days in the US per year, which is approximately 4 months, you will be considered a US resident alien for tax purposes. So that's the general rule, the substantial presence test. There are certain exceptions, and the first one is that there are certain categories of exempt individuals. For example, students or trainees under an F or a J visa. They don't need to take their US days into account for calculating the substantial presence test. Another example is the closer connection exception, which means that if you have a closer connection to another country where you still have a tax home, you can claim that you're considered a US non-resident alien for tax purposes. But one of the conditions to claim the closer connection is that you need to be present in the US for less than 183 days during the current year. Another thing is that the US has entered into agreements for the avoidance of double taxation with other countries like the Netherlands, Belgium. And one of the typical articles refers to residency. So if you're considered a resident of both the US and the Netherlands, for example, the tiebreaker rules will determine in what country you're a resident for tax purposes. So for example, if you move to the US but you still have a home in the Netherlands, or your family remained in the US while you are in the US, you could rely on such a treaty to claim that you're a US non-resident alien for tax purposes, even if you meet the substantial present test. And specifically related to COVID-19, there's an emergency period which basically says for persons that were forced to remain into the US because of COVID-19, they can exclude up to 60 days of their presence in the US to calculate the substantial presence test, which might provide some relief for certain individuals that were forced to stay longer in the US. So that's the first step to determine whether you're a US resident or non-resident alien for tax purposes. And once that's done, we can look at what needs to be reported on a US individual tax return. For US non-resident aliens, they're only subject to US taxation on their US source income. And what is US source income? It's effectively connected income and FDAP income. So effectively connected income is, for example, compensation for services performed in the US, which is taxed at graduated rates that range from 10% to 37%. FDAP income, on the other hand, it's, for example, dividends paid by a US company, and that is taxed according to US rules at a flat 30% rate. Capital gains are exempt for non-resident individuals from US taxation. Non-resident individuals can also claim no standard deduction. They cannot file a joint return together with their spouse. And it's important that also the tax treaties with other countries are taken into account, because, as I said, those are the US rules, but the tax treaties may reduce the US withholding tax rate or even exempt the income from US taxation. So might look a bit more complex if you have to file two tax returns, one as a non-resident in the US and one as a resident in your home country. But overall, it might give a better tax result, because if you would be taxed 100% in your home country, if some of that income is actually taxable in the US at lower rates, that might give an overall better result, and you might have less taxes to pay in an overall tax situation. US residents, it's another story. The filing status and the tax rates are the same as for US citizens, and they are subject to US taxation on worldwide income. So regardless if it's US source or foreign source, the income needs to be reported on a US resident tax return. To limit the impact of potential double taxation, there's a possibility to claim a tax credit for any taxes that need to be paid in a foreign country. And another difference with US non-residents is that US residents have certain reporting requirements with respect to foreign financial assets. So if you have a foreign bank account, ownership in a foreign corporation, it's really important that you take those reporting requirements into account, because the penalties for non-compliance can be very high. And finally, it's really important for foreign business owners that are moving to the US to look at what the US tax implications are. And why? That has to do with the GILTI inclusion. The GILTI inclusion, it means global intangible low taxed income, and it's intended to tax the earnings of controlled foreign corporations. So controlled foreign corporations are those corporations that are owned by 50% or more US persons. So if you're moving to the US and you own the foreign business, you might have to include in your income a GILTI calculation, and there might be an impact on your US taxation. So that's why it's really important to take that into account, because there might be certain structuring alternatives available that could limit the impact for the US taxation, but it's important that it's reviewed before moving to the US. And that's the end of my presentation as a short introduction into the individual US tax system. If you have questions, please feel free to contact me. My contact details are here. And with this, I'm going to hand it over to Jacob.
Great. I hope you can hear me, and let me share my screen. There we go. Everyone can hear me. Thank you so much, Ben, and welcome everyone. My name is Jacob Willemsen. I founded TAPS about 10 years ago, after I'd done a lot of business development already for European companies in the US. I found out that they had difficulties maintaining a US entity and being compliant. So I did actually more and more hand-holding on that side rather than business development. And eventually I pivoted the company, and we are now focused on hand-holding. Basically, every European company that needs to set up a US subsidiary, we try to alleviate them from all kinds of admin matters. A quick overview of our services. Yes, we do a lot in-house, but we also work with partners, and that's how this webinar came about, because we work quite a bit with IMS, but also attorneys and real estate agents, relocation services, name it. Basically, we're trying to make sure that the company can focus on building its business in the US and not on all kinds of nitty-gritty. I'm going to take you, well, first let me show you kind of an overview of our clients. Yes, it is from companies like FRISS and Office Athletes from the Netherlands, but it's also a company like BioNTech from Germany. Some of you may recognize that name from a certain vaccine that we're all hoping to get soon, and hotels and everything in between. So we are not really industry specific. Today's topics. I think it's important to guide you. I've been asked to focus on HR and payroll. How do you set up a team in the US? And therefore, I think this is a good list of topics to guide you through. I'll be the first one to admit that it's kind of a high-speed train that I'll take you on. In 15 minutes, there's a lot to tell you. So I may not touch upon every bullet point, but it is, those bullet points are also there to kind of make, if you review it later on, to make you realize that these are things that you have to take into account. And obviously, if you have certain questions about it, there's time after these sessions to ask those questions. Now let's start from the incorporation, because if you want a payroll in the US, one of the first questions that foreign companies say, can I payroll from my Dutch BV or from my Belgian BVBA? Technically, yes, you can. Is it highly advised not to do it? Yes, unless you perhaps set up a special entity. And why? That's very simple. If I, 15 years ago, asked companies what their main concern was when doing business in the US, it was product liability. If I ask nowadays, it is employer liability. So what you want to do is, if you payroll in the US, you want to put that in a separate US company. In addition, it's also so much easier to payroll through a US entity than through a foreign entity. Now, obviously, if you want to set up that company, you have to go through a certain list of processes. Well, you need to get a tax ID. Nowadays, that is not as easy. One of the authorized persons in Europe, or a person that has control over the entity, needs to have a social security number or an ITIN, individual tax ID number. That may take some time to get that if you're based in Europe. Obviously, you need to open a bank account. Don't underestimate that. I know that Belgians have a good bank, and there are also some banks in the US that allow for foreign ownership. And be careful. Sometimes an account manager will pull you in, and yes, you can open the bank account, but 6 months later, you'll have a due diligence from or a KYC audit from the bank, and you may need to close the account again because they realize that you were foreign owned. So make very sure, whatever bank you go to, that the bank is aware of the fact and really realizes that this is a foreign owned US subsidiary. Obviously, in order to payroll, you need to register in that state as an employer. Don't underestimate that. I'm based in New York. A lot of companies don't realize that if they have employees in the state of New Jersey, and those people nowadays with COVID work out of New Jersey, they need to register in New Jersey as an employer. Don't underestimate it. Employment in the US is a state matter, which means that you also may need to pay state corporate income tax. Well, you definitely have to pay state corporate income tax, but in that state where you're employing. There are certain software to do payroll yourself. If I would advise something for the US, it is don't go on the cheap with software that is made for US-owned companies and simple matters. What you see a lot is foreign companies may need to payroll expats, and expats don't have to pay certain taxes. Does that software really take into account that you need to have these kinds of exceptions? And if you take one thing from what I say today, it is don't payroll without workers' compensation insurance. Workers' compensation insurance is basically if someone gets injured while on the job, that they're covered, and that's taken very seriously in the US. I don't want to scare you too much, but if in New York State, for instance, you would not have workers' comp insurance, the penalties can really run up to $2,000 per 10 days per person. So that is something that you don't want to allow to lapse, or if you forget to pay the premiums. Quickly to the expats in the US. Obviously, and the Consul-General already alluded to it, it's important to have a good location where the cost of living is acceptable, where the family from Europe can really adapt, but also where the connection is good and where you have enough time to communicate with Europe. Later on, Jeroen may elaborate, Jeroen Morenhoff, because that is important where you set up your US entity. I use the abbreviations, the SVB versus the Social Security, and that is important because if you have expats from Europe, they may be better off paying their social securities or their voluntary contributions in the Netherlands or Belgium rather than in the US. The reason, if you pay less than 40 quarters, that's 10 years, into the US system for Social Security, you're never going to see any benefit. So you would be better off just paying voluntarily in the Netherlands and at least get something in return when you retire in the Netherlands. Salary and gross and allowances are also important. Take into account that your employee may ask for guarantees what their net salary will be. even though it's understandable, don't commit in contract to these kinds of net salary require or demands, because it's a pain in the neck to calculate those. Taxes in the US are very complicated. And if your admin office needs to make sure that every month the net salary is exactly the same, you're going to have a hard time. And you're going to spend a lot of money on admin. So yes, you can use averages or targets, but try in contracts to make sure that you have gross amounts. Health insurance, let's quickly go over that. Health insurance, obviously, in the US is super expensive. Be prepared for that. You may be better off actually allowing the expat to take the health insurance from Europe. There are, for the Netherlands, for instance, Oom and the Goudse, that have very good health insurance, great coverage, low deductibles, low copays, and actually the premium is not that bad. So once you have that expat onboarded, usually you're going to start onboarding other people in the US team, right? And for that, you have to be a little careful with your first hire. Your first hire may be the manager or and you want to obviously lure that person in with great conditions. But in certain cases, those conditions will set a precedent for anyone else that you're going to hire if you're not careful. Also, these people, you may need to get them from large companies. You want to have the cream of the crop. So if you want to lure someone from another job, you probably have to offer that person health insurance. But guess what? Practically, you're not able to offer health insurance yet, because the first employee, if you only have one employee, you cannot offer health insurance technically. So you're going to have a in-between situation where you offer to contribute towards the expenses of a health insurance. Those kinds of things are very important in your job offer. And I say job offer and not necessarily a contract, because it is very common in the US to work on an at-will basis. Sure, if you really need to give some guarantees and you want to pull someone away from a steady job, you may need to give some guarantees, but typically employment in the US is at will. Important as well is exempt versus non-exempt. What does that mean? If you offer a salary lower than a certain amount in a state, you are mandated to pay overtime and pay extra in the weekends. And unless you pay a certain salary or people have a management function, then they are exempt. But otherwise, you have to be pretty careful that you do pay overtime for non-exempt people. Obviously, in the US, the paperwork and onboarding documents are something to take a closer look at. You need to make sure that the people have a work permit, and that you also in your own system put deadlines for when these work permits need to get renewed, when they need to show that they have extended their visa. We have had quite a number of people in the past that forgot that they were actually employing someone whose visa was expired. And then the mandatory training, and that is actually the case in Illinois as well as in New York and California and a lot of other states. It's mandatory that you train people on certain topics. One of them that's very obvious at the moment is the sexual harassment training. Take that into account. Make sure that people sign off that they have had that training. Quickly, I go to the benefits. Obviously, health insurance at the moment is the most important benefit that you can offer to a employee. Typically, in the US, that is for the East Coast at least, $600 a month per person is really nothing. If you want to help insure the whole family, you can easily pay $2,000 a month. Take that into account when you create your budgets. What is not as involved is the retirement. If you want to contribute as an employer in a retirement, you basically pay for setting up the program. Usually that's a 401k. And then you can decide that already creates a much higher threshold for the employee to save money pre-tax. And then you can also, as an employer, decide to contribute. If the employee puts in 5% of their salary, then you can say, then I'll put 5% as an employer in as well. And there are many other benefits. In the past, I would say salary was by far the most important in the US, but you see over the last decade that health insurance is actually inevitable, that you're going to offer that. Maybe you cannot do it yet in your first year with your first employee, but once you grow a team and you want to keep or you want to retain people, you need to offer health insurance. Something that I will only quickly touch upon: employee handbook. It is definitely a good thing to have an employee handbook. Maybe not from your first employee, but once you start getting more and more people, make sure that it describes how you deal with certain policies, equal employer opportunities, work schedules, but also certain state policies, like the sexual harassment training, that it's in the handbook that people need to have that training, that people need to report certain things within so many days. That really protects you. And actually your insurances will go down, your employer insurance, if you have a good handbook. Now, in order to get rid of all that admin, a lot of companies decide to go for a co-employer who takes over these kinds of issues from you as a startup company. And a lot of companies go for a professional employer organization. What happens? You basically pay them an admin fee, and because of that, they allow you to benefit from the healthcare insurance premiums that they negotiated. Obviously, you as a 2-person, 3-person startup team are not going to get the best health insurance rates, and a PEO may be a very good option in that case. So look into that. And then the last but not least in the cycle is, of course, when you need to terminate people. Unfortunately, the hit ratio and reading resumes right, you will have to live and learn. It comes with some mishires. And it is a misperception that you can just put people at the curb and think that an at-will agreement means that you can fire on Friday and not have any exposure to paying in the future. So what you see a lot is that you will need to negotiate a termination or a release letter where the employee states that nothing strange happens and they were not discriminated against and things like that. And that is going to cost you a little bit of money. Be prepared for that. And yeah, from a European standpoint, I think that's only good employment to make sure that you separate in a decent way. The other way around, I got actually from one of the other partners that we work with on the accounting side, notice on Friday that one of their staff members on Friday at 4:50 p.m. had given notice, and they were leaving at 5. Right? It is employment at will. If staff wants to leave, they leave, and they give you no notice. Don't take that personally. It happens to the best of us. Make sure also that the final payout is non-negotiable. Right? A lot of people say, well, you first need to give back the computer or this or that or such or so. No. For anything that the employee worked, you have to pay them with the next payroll. Don't negotiate on that part because it will bite you in the end if the employee or the terminated person is going to fight their termination. And COBRA is very important as well. COBRA is basically if you offered health insurance, the employee has the opportunity to make sure that they can stay insured for health expenses. They do have to pay the premium completely themselves from that moment on, but they are allowed to stay on the employer healthcare package. Now, final note, what we see, and TAPS actually did a research in 2013, 2017, and 2020 on the experience of companies that set up shop in the US. And most of the companies that had issues said that they experienced those issues, especially on the cross-cultural sections. The managing of a team from Europe is not as easy as it looks like. Make sure that you really put time into that. Obviously, there's a time difference. Europe has to make sure that they cannot leave at 4 p.m. or 5 p.m. every day if you have an office in the US. And last but not least, manage your US bank account well. We have seen so many times that companies are out of money, literally out of money when they need to pay their salaries, their payroll. And the thing is, you'd be surprised, but in the US, payroll companies, they take the money from your account and then pay all the organizations, the tax authorities, the insurance, the employees. And it's not like most of Europe where they tell you who to pay, what to pay, and that you make the initiative of paying people, which means that 2 days before the end of the month, they will draw all that money from your account, and there better be money in that account. You're gonna perhaps giggle a little, but it happens so often, and it really leads to issues. That was my presentation. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact me. These are the ways to get in touch with us. And with that, I would like to give the floor to Sophie Bouteligier. And she will also moderate the session after that. Sophie, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jacob. And thank you to Ben and Jacob for having me here. My name is Sophie Bouteligier. I'm originally from Belgium, then living in Silicon Valley since 2015. I started my business here, Expandify, where I help companies with their international expansion strategy and also try to inspire European entrepreneurs by the American way of doing business. Yes, the USA is a fantastic country to live, also a fantastic place to do business. Yeah, first of all, it's a huge market, 330 million potential consumers. So for B2C, but also for B2B, it has huge potential. Even if you operate in a niche markets, it's still a gigantic market. It's also very business friendly, easier to get permits to establish a business, but also entrepreneurship is really welcomed here. People love it. Skilled workforce, and yeah, then also that American spirit of doing business is really contagious. Like, yes, the can-do mentality, thinking big, being ambitious, no ideas too big. But all those elements also really make it a very competitive market because there is such a huge potential. Of course, also so many companies want to do business here. So in some regions, it is really a fight for customers, fight for the best employees. So you really have to be ready when you want to come to the USA. Prepare yourself, build that strategy, have that strong implementation, because the potential of the market is also why also represents or makes its biggest challenges. Yes, some common challenges that I see with businesses that want to expand to the USA is, first of all, yes, the complexity and the size of the US markets sometimes makes it very easy to lose focus, where people start to focus on too many things at the same time. In USA, they have that fantastic saying, spray and pray, which doesn't work, doesn't lead to results. A second challenge that I see is that it is sometimes underestimated how different and how diverse the US market is. So make sure you understand the market, that you do your research when you're coming here. And we also sometimes see a lack of commitment. When you're coming to the USA, show that you are here for the long term, that you are here to stay, and that you really mean it seriously. Today, I am going to have a conversation with two entrepreneurs, Ryan and Jeroen. I will let them introduce themselves, but I can already say that they are entrepreneurs active in very different industries, and that they both are very successful in tackling this competitive market. So it promises to be a very interesting discussion. Welcome, Jeroen and Ryan. If you could also unmute yourself.
Thank you.
Could you just shortly, yes, present yourself, your business, what's the history of your business, but then also like, what's the reason that you decided to come to the USA? Jeroen?
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. Thank you, Sophie. So my name is Jeroen Morenhoff, and I'm the co-founder and CEO of FRISS. FRISS is a software company, software as a service company that offers software for insurers to detect and prevent fraud. We're doing that very successfully. We started out of the Netherlands. We've been able to expand in Europe, and we are now serving 187 customers in 42 countries. It is about in 2018, so a little bit 2.5 years ago, that we've decided to expand to the US. We raised, in order to do so, we raised money. We had capital raise end of 2017, and I personally moved to Chicago in the summer of 2018. And I'm happy to share more of my learnings later, but that's me.
Thank you, Ryan.
Hello, Sophie. Thanks for having me here today. Morning, everyone, and afternoon for those people watching in Europe. So my name's Ryan Pavey. You can probably tell I am not from the Netherlands or Belgium. I'm from England, but I'm the most confused man in the world because I'm an Englishman working for a Dutch company living in America. I work for a company called Bakker-Elkhuizen. They're based or headquartered in Voigt, just outside Den Bosch in the Netherlands. And for 25 years, over 25 years actually now, they have been kind of leading the market in office ergonomics in Europe. And that has been with both equipment, things like laptop risers, keyboards and mice, and software to help people avoid injury whilst working at their computer. We very early on identified the US as a potentially huge market for us, with the tech companies and software companies on the West Coast in particular that have a lot of computer-based employees. The market out here for an ergonomics company was absolutely huge. So in 2018, I moved over here and got Bakker-Elkhuizen set up with the help of Tabs. And I'll fill you in as we carry on through this conversation.
So both of your businesses already had a strong foundation in your home country and in Europe, which definitely helps when expanding to the US to build credibility. Can you tell us a little bit more about that expansion journey? Like, how did you prepare your company, and what was your market entry strategy, Jeroen?
Yeah, I'm happy to do. So first of all, I mean, we were established in the Netherlands and in Europe, and we had a lot of customers. But I mean, in the end, local references do not count in the US, unfortunately. And we had 0 customers in the US, so that our market entry was definitely not easy. And it was also way more expensive than I expected. And I think that's, I guess, the first advice. I mean, we were in a situation that we just did this capital raise, and that was a big part of the reason that we did the capital raise. But even if you expect it to be more expensive, then you expect it's still more expensive than you expect, if that makes sense. And I think the point that you also made, Sophie, in your introduction is the commitment to the market. So one of the things so I've moved to Chicago as the CEO of the company, although 90% of my team is in the Netherlands, also showed the commitment to this market. So, and it's I don't know how often I've said it, but I am not leaving this country before FRISS is beyond reasonable doubt. That is a quote that I basically made in all the pitches that we've made, and said, this is my personal commitment to this market. It's not like we are just another well-funded company that just tries to throw some money at the US and see if it sticks. No, we are here to be successful, and I think that's been very critical for our success in our market entry. And I think the other element that which is also good, when I talk to all these investors about moving to the US or to expand to the US, they also all ask them, why are you going to be successful? And I think when I talk to my peers and other companies that have done that, showing that as a personal commitment as a CEO is definitely something that stood out and was also well received by the investors. Although they had some doubt if I would still be managing the European business as well. The other important element that I want to stress, it is not maybe to market entry, but it is definitely very important to the success, is doing this together with your family. I'm here with my wife and 3 kids, and this is just pulling them out of their normal life, which is all for them, right, and getting them into a total new environment, and doing this together. Because the impact for the family is very big, and so what we've done is to involve them, not so much the kids, not so much in the decision, and that's something that my wife and I made, but to involve them in everything else afterwards. Like we did a round tour through a couple of cities like Chicago, but also New York and Boston and other cities, to say, okay, where are we going to stay? How does these schools look like? What is the places that we're going to live? So there was something we did really well together, and I think that was very important for our success. Not so much as a company to enter the market, but definitely as a family to enter this country.
Thank you, Jeroen. Ryan, how did you show when you were coming to this market that you really was here, that you mean it serious, and that you're here for the long term?
Well, we perhaps provide a bit of a cautionary tale, because we had a very soft entrance to the US for the previous kind of 10 years before 2018. We had a distributor out here who was sending our products to customers and generated a few sales. And it created a demand, but what it meant was that distributor was kind of overpricing our products and setting the kind of wrong expectations for us in the marketplace. So really, when we entered the market in 2018, our first task was to make sure the US knew what our prices were going to be, and how they were going to be different to what those customers had seen over the last 10 years. A lot of what we heard when we first came out here was, we love your products, but they're too expensive. So a big mission we had was to kind of reverse that problem, and the US does not forget easily. So it took quite a lot of effort to kind of start bringing people round to the fact that Bacher Leverkusen was now here as a direct supplier, and that companies could buy our products the same price that their European offices were paying for the products, because the demand for our stuff was already here. A lot of US ergonomists working for multinational companies had seen our products in Europe, had liked them, and then had just struggled to get hold of them in the US. So something for people to keep in mind is to be fully committed to the US market, to not come at it with a half effort or what you think is going to be a cheap cheating way to do it. Make sure that you plan properly for that US entry and be fully committed. Similar to what Jeroen said there, another thing to be prepared for, just from a personal perspective, I'm very close with my family back home in the UK, and it is hard on everyone when someone moves kind of 4,000 odd miles away from them, particularly in a global pandemic when travel is more restricted. So that's something that people should definitely keep in mind, and perhaps build into their plan that they are going to come back to their home country, you know, once a quarter, once every 6 months and spend good time with their family back home.
Thank you, Ryan. And indeed, in both of your stories, you feel how important it is not only the business, but also that you can establish here a good personal life and that you feel happy. What I mentioned in the introductions is that sometimes because it's such a huge and complex market, people come here, they start to focus on too many different things with little results. How did you approach the US market? Like, were there certain regions that you decided to focus on, certain segments? How did you make sure you had that focus right, Jeroen?
Yeah, thanks. We're selling B2B enterprise software, right? So these are it's sort of kind of whale hunting. So if we sell 2 or 3 deals a year, we have a good year, right? So per sales. So this means that for us to really establish and find where are those, this is a huge market. So focus is crucial because if you can select from, I don't know how many companies there are in the US, but then there are, let's say, 500 insurers that might be in our target spot, then the finding those 2, 3 they're going to decide to work with us is key. So looking at what are the best partners, looking at what is our product best fit, and drilling down to very targeted. Our approach has been our approach, at least to set and win the first customers, because we needed those local references, as I mentioned before. And then in the end, if you look at what are the first deals that we've closed, these were in the end somebody that trusted us, trusted me, that we could deliver, that based on my word, they said, okay, I'm going to make that gamble and I'm going to go with you. Although there is a local incumbent that everybody goes with, that's a safe choice. I take the risk. And I think that's also a good thing. I think for the American industry, they're more willing, and insurers are typically not very willing to take risks. But I see here in the US that these companies are more willing to take that risk and to take a gamble with a new provider in the market. And I think I kind of used that angle as well, as we've been very established but new, as kind of the scale up and the startup combination, and being the new kids and the exciting hot startup in the US, although we know what we're talking about, and we've kind of used that angle. And that's also how I got on stage, especially in the first year, because we were actually looking to get on stage. And obviously now with COVID, there's not a lot of physical stages, at least. But that was a great way for us to kind of leverage that hottest, newest startup from Europe coming to the US. And one thing that I think is also important, which I've underestimated, to be fair, is the fact that we believe that this market is a big market, has a lot of potential, and it's just the US, right? So the fact that you have that a lot of things are regulated on a state level, or even for insurance on a county level, makes it very difficult and different to really provide these services and localize your product to the market. And although I'm here and I'm the CEO of the company, it's still hard to convey, let's say, the complexity of such a market to the team in the Netherlands, where most of the product development takes place. So I'm going to the Netherlands. I went to the Netherlands before COVID every 6 to 8 weeks for 10 days and try to do that, but also bringing people from the Netherlands over and talk to your customers, talk to your prospects, talk to other partners in the market. It was super crucial. And I've started doing that too late, I would say. So I would definitely advise to start that as soon as possible.
Yeah, and what you say, like, about being the new kid on the block, indeed, as a new player in a market where there's already so many other players that know the market, that it's often not only about being a little bit better, but trying to be really different and standing out. So thank you for your
yeah. So you've used the orange everywhere. We had orange. We're not just being there in a gray suit, but we had our orange polos, and we've done everything to stand out. Yeah, it's a good addition. I think we've mentioned that in the pre-discussion. Yeah, thanks for pointing that out, Sophie. Yeah.
So, and Ryan, how did you approach the US market?
We did a lot of pre-planning. It is such a huge country, and every state is almost like a separate country in Europe. If you're going to do a comparison, they have different cultures and different ways of doing business. So we did a lot of research beforehand on what kind of companies in the US value ergonomics, value employee health and wellness, because culturally it changes. You know, the West Coast and San Francisco are very employee focused in terms of health and well-being, whereas New York can be a little bit cutthroat in certain industries. Our product, you know, it's tempting to go kind of scattergun and try and hit everyone, because every company does have office-based employees, but that is not the kind of way to do it, because a lot of people in the US who don't understand and don't care about the wellness of their employees will laugh you out of the building and just won't talk to you. So we did a lot of research into who was going to be most receptive. Part of that research was looking at LinkedIn and connecting with kind of the appropriate decision makers before even we started coming out here. So, you know, we looked for companies that had ergonomics programs, that had ergonomics program managers. We kind of focused on where we were going to be most successful. Now, that happens to be on the West Coast, but we decided not to move to the West Coast. We decided on Chicago because it is that perfect point, time zone wise, between the Netherlands and the West Coast. So we thought it was a strategically strong place to set up our business so that we could still communicate effectively with Europe, but also be well positioned to travel wherever the business was in the US.
Yes, the time difference, I'm on the West Coast, so I feel what you're saying. The report that Jacob was also mentioning, the report published by TEPS called Dutch Ventures in the United States, also states one of the reasons why sometimes it just doesn't work out in the US is because people underestimate those cultural differences. You both also moved from Europe to the US. How did you experience those cultural differences? And do you have specific advice for entrepreneurs that are willing to take the leap, Jeroen?
Yeah, so I think the US culture is great. I mean, in the way that we have been welcomed here, how friendly people are. And we had really complete strangers in the first week here that never heard of us. Or that heard of us and say, okay, we're going to help you and help you with your kids on school, get play dates on the first week. Complete strangers. I don't think anyone that would move from the US to the Netherlands would experience the same way how we've been welcomed here. And they always are nice, like, okay, oh yeah, my grandparents also came from Scandinavia, and so it's really so it's not everybody knows exactly Europe was it about, but the friendliness is really great. The disadvantage of that obviously is also that it's sometimes what's superficial and people invite you, but then really do not invite you in the end. I mean, it's kind of a nice thing to ask, and we should have dinner, but that never happens, or not always happens, right? And also the and that's also a little bit in the indirect way of communicating. And so we are way more direct. That's obviously what the Dutch especially are known for, but that is something that I've had to learn to live with and work with. And also when you're building, so this is more for the family, but if you're building a team, in the beginning, I thought I was the most lucky entrepreneur in the world. Like, I found the best candidates. They were super uniquely qualified, were totally committed to our long-term goals, and always wanted to work with a company like FRISS. And until I guess they found a better opportunity. So that loyalty and that at will is definitely perceived different. And it's also like in the Netherlands is you're used to, like, okay, I'm not feeling, I mean, in my current role, I'm looking for, can we do something? This is not an open discussion you have. It's just like, I think Jacob mentioned, you could have somebody resign at 4:30 and not be in the office on the next day. And I do take that personally. So it's a good advice, Jacob, but it's hard to not take that personal. But I think in the end, after a while, also explaining how I'd like to cooperate, how I like to work together, kind of the combination of the US friendliness and the European Dutch way of working. I think we found a good mix, and I think also you find the people that fit with that kind of company that are willing to also work for such a company is what I found in the end. So I think that takes time, and you should invest in that. You should be very try to convey, let's say, the way you want to work, the way you are, and that's after a while that sticks. And for the rest, I mean, building a local team is very hard. Higher salaries, all these benefits, payroll things, and it's just a lot of work. That, especially if you're just setting up a shop, is not something that you want to worry about too much yourself. And so that's why we're using Tabs and others as well to help us on that, because it's just too much of a distraction for running and being successful.
And Ryan, how did you experience it being an Englishman in the US?
So you'd think, so an Englishman in New York. So you'd think that it would be easier for me, but that kind of, I guess, assumption probably made it harder, because Jeroen is absolutely right. The American people are really friendly. They're very engaging, but sometimes that is not committed engagement. If you see if that makes sense, they are very welcoming and they seem enthusiastic, but then they disappear, and you literally don't hear from them after that. They have moved on to the next thing. So you have to kind of have a strong psyche to be able to just get over any kind of rejection like that and move on to the next one, no matter how kind of friendly or charming or whatever you are. It's not anything personal. It's just how they communicate, how they do business out here. One thing that I would kind of urge anyone coming out here, particularly, I have Dutch colleagues who are, as Jeroen said, very direct. You have to be a diplomat when you move to the US and stay very neutral on key topics. The US are a very passionate population about certain things like politics, religion, their constitution, so on and so forth. And it's best to stay out of those kind of debates, stay out of that conversation, because one simple word, one simple opinion could wipe out 50% of your audience. So in your marketing strategy, in the way you do business, in the way you interact with people, be very independent, be very neutral on things.
All very recognizable also from my side here in you both moved here pre-COVID, then of course in 2021, we are going still through a very challenging time. Luckily we have good news with the vaccines and there's light at the end of the tunnel. But how did COVID impact your business, Jeroen?
So as an entrepreneur, I was worried when obviously, like many of us, in February, March, and not knowing the extent and the duration, obviously, of how this would take and what the impact would be on my company, and if insurers would churn on me or not. But if I would look at this now at the end of the year, early the next year, we have more customers than ever signed up. We had the best year in the history, and it makes sense as well, because in the end, in times of crisis, people tend to defraud more, right? So to make ends meet, and so insurers see that and wanted to react to that. So that gave us more business actually, and also there's more digital transformation where we play a nice role in as well, without doing too much of a pitch, but. For us, COVID was in the end, from a business perspective, was great, and also the impact that it had that I mean, I was trying to hire local, so in Chicago, but I've ended up hiring across the US rather than hiring local anymore. So I've kind of forgot about being too strict on that. I do feel sorry for people that are coming now, because I think what I've done in the early year and a half before COVID hit was a lot of on the road. I was on a plane every week, meeting people, going to events, going on site. And I think I've built that network and relationships then, and that I'd be able to continue doing business over the last, 10, 11 months. But yeah, so setting this up now is definitely has to rethink that strategy. And the last thing I wanted to say is that that for me, the other impact that it has, especially with my communication with my team, I think Ryan mentioned as well, going back. So I went back every, let's say, 2 months for 10 days. I've not been in the Netherlands for 11 months, not seen my family and friends, but also not my colleagues there. And I think the difference and the distinction of being online and not being able to meet each other and discuss a lot of things has definitely had an impact on how I run my company. And yeah, so that's also a big impact for me.
And then Ryan, your end users or employees, and of course, COVID completely changed that market. How did you expect?
Yeah. So the COVID came along, and obviously everyone started to work from home. And for Bakker in a lot of ways, that was obviously the ideal situation, although it came around from a very tragic and horrible situation. But what happened in the US market and actually throughout Europe is what was previously a business-to-business arrangement became a business-to-consumer arrangement because companies were allowing their employees to work from home and then delegating the purchasing decision for how their office would be set up to the end user employee via stipends and allowances in their paycheck. So whereas previously we'd get an order for, a few hundred items or a few thousand items from the purchasing department of a company, they were now saying we're not doing that, and it's about our employees' individual decision going forward. So we had to very quickly change our strategy so that we were both available to business and available to consumers, and that involved a lot of kind of going back into our network of contacts out here, making sure that their customer-facing websites and channels were open, setting up our own web store, making sure that we were on Amazon, so that wherever these companies were advising their employees to go, we were there. So we became kind of half business to business and half business to consumer at that point. So that was a little bit of a stressful time and a quick pivot. But thanks to how flexible the US market is and how quickly things can be done out here, we were able to do that. So that kind of really was how COVID affected us in the short term. Long term, obviously, what it's done is created this work from home culture in the US that didn't exist in the past. So long term, we know that by continuing to commit to the US market, actually our future in the US has become even more promising.
Yeah, so it was like once you had everything figured out that you had to adapt everything again to the new situation.
And I think Jeroen said that quite early on. He said that what you think in terms of how business runs in Europe and how culturally things work in Europe is very different out here. So that's where you have to kind of move off of your plan a little bit and be prepared to adapt to those elements of the American market. Stay focused on what your plan is from a strategic point of view, but from a tactical perspective, when you're there on the floor, make sure that you can be adaptable in that sense.
So thank you very much, Jeroen, and for Ryan for sharing your experiences. It's always very valuable for entrepreneurs that they hear how others were doing it. short recap of our discussion in a few tips. First of all, there's not one way to success. We heard from Ryan, Jeroen, very different approaches, both very successful. Do not copy paste. Don't think what you did in the Netherlands or in other countries that it will also work in the USA. Third, have a really clear focus, but be flexible. And I love this expression by Jeff Bezos, who says, be fixed on the vision, but be flexible on the journey. And that really applies in such a market as USA. Show commitment, show you're here for the long term. And then, yes, finally, also be aware and respect those cultural differences. I believe that's like, in a nutshell, the conversation we had. So yes, thank you very much for being here, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sophie,
Thank
and
you.
thank you, Jeroen and Ryan, for this very interesting, practical panel discussion. We now have time for some Q&A. Some questions came in. First was a very practical one about the recording. Well, this will be sent out. The webinar was recorded, so everyone will receive it by email. A second question that came in from Robert was about opening a US bank account. That was a question for Jacob, but maybe for other people. But Jacob, what do you recommend when you open a US bank account? Yeah, please.
Yeah, well, there are some options for both Belgium and the Netherlands, right? If you are with the Rabobank or if you are with KBC, there are some options for you. However, I saw that in our session, we actually had Bastiaan van den Berg of the First American Bank. Coincidentally or not, he's also the president of the Dutch American Chamber of Commerce in Chicago. So reach out to him. They are a good option if you bank with ABN AMRO or ING. It's a very smooth transition. And there are some other options as well. Be careful with, unfortunately, some of the bigger banks. We had a very good relationship with Chase, Wells Fargo, HSBC, and unfortunately, because they got such huge penalties a couple of years ago for not exactly knowing who their customers were, they started to close down on accounts where they just didn't make enough money to justify the know your customer tests that they have to do. Right? They have to know where you got your money from for money laundering purposes. So you cannot really blame them. They're a commercial organization as well. But take that into account. I also want to say those companies who were with smaller banks and applied for PPP loans and other funds, they had a much better success rate with those smaller banks because they are flexible. They didn't have very rigid online systems where one of the first questions was, is your company foreign owned? If so, tough luck, you won't be eligible for this loan, which was nothing that this SBA said, but it was just easy for those banks to weed out the less interesting clients. So I can highly recommend getting in touch with Bastiaan. There are some other options as well. Obviously, if it's important to you, if you have a hair salon or if you have a local shop that needs to have access to cash or cash drop-offs, then you may have to go to a larger local bank. But otherwise, I would definitely recommend going to Bastiaan. You have the Comerica Bank in Houston, which is for us always a good option. Reach out to me. We have some other options as well, depending also on the industry that you're in and the purpose of your bank. So feel free to reach out.
Thank you, Jacob. Next is a question from Daniel for Jeroen. Jeroen, concerning market entry being more costly than expected, which points would you say are most often underestimated?
Okay, yeah. So I would say across the board. So we've obviously pre-planned and we've made our budgets. And when it comes to all the things that you put in your budget, you should maybe double it. Finding the right people, and then ending up finding the second or the third being the right person takes more time. Adapting product in the end takes more time. So it's like everything you plan for, you kind of plan sort of a sunny scenario. Although you think you are being conservative, you plan for a more sunny scenario than it turns out to be. And then on top of that, the cost of living is just also much higher than. I mean, it's like you the first time you go into a Whole Foods, you say, "This is crazy. I'm not buying anything." And now I don't know what we're buying, but it's coming here by every day on our front door, and I've stopped thinking about it. But that's kind of the mindset that is changing as well. But you think you're planning too much for things will go perfect, and not everything goes perfect. So I guess that's why it's good to have that money, and also to be able to commit to that personal commitment that I said, right? So if all of a sudden it takes not 1 year but 2 years or 3 years to be successful, people will still want to know if you have these deep pockets, the pockets are deep enough to actually put money where your mouth is. I think that would be my answer. Maybe if Ryan has something to add, but.
No, I'd agree with that. I think there's also some kind of hidden costs in the US that you don't have in Europe. Best example I can think of off the top of my head is pre-COVID, we did lots of exhibitions, and there's quite a lot of labor unions in the US for different tasks. So what you'll find is you think you've paid for the exhibition, you've booked your stand, and then you get at the end of the event like a manual handling charge for the people that set everything up and move everything around, or a materials handling charge as they call it out here. And even for a small stand, that can be $1,000 or $2,000 that you just didn't have in your budget for the show. So there are always kind of little additions that come along because of, again, the business culture out here, and it is a very unionized country.
Thank you, Ryan. Thank you, Jeroen. I noticed that Jacob has one more point to add to the banks topic. Go ahead, Jacob.
Yeah, I wanted to manage the expectation, and I think Ryan and Jeroen can attest to it. Don't have your hopes up too high with US banks in general. If you arrive somewhere at a bank, whether it is the First American Bank, the Rabobank, or KBC, or the system in the US is still about a decade behind what you're used to in the Netherlands. That is no reflection of the bank itself. So it's not that they are less. I always say, once you've banked in the US, you're starting to appreciate your European bank a lot more. It's really much more efficient.
I would absolutely agree with that. I think there's a couple of things from the financial perspective for people to keep in mind. Something that surprised me, and actually Bastian and First American were very good for me personally when I moved out here. In the UK, I have a perfect credit score with Experian, a company that also exists in the US, but my UK Experian credit score does not count for anything in the USA. So you will have trouble getting credit cards and things like that to begin with. You have to concentrate on kind of building up your personal credit rating, of course, in conjunction with your business credit and reputation. And very similarly to what Jacob just said, in the UK, I bank with First Direct, which is a company known for part of HSBC, but a company known for its kind of customer service, it's the quality of its banking app and software and things like that. The US is not at that level right now, and actually banking is very much a person-to-person thing still here. So being able to work with someone like Bastian, you do get that kind of personal, old-fashioned almost relationship with your bank that is kind of taken away with banking technology in Europe.
Yeah, I totally. I'm also part of the Bastian fan club that I see we are all part of here. But no, it's a personal relation, and I'm as a tech entrepreneur, I looked at the Silicon Valley Bank, and that is the biggest disgrace for Silicon Valley. This bank that exists. I mean, this is totally tech is non-existent at that whole bank. And one thing that the tip that I got, and I think that shows how stupid this whole system is like, the first month I was here, I needed to buy a car. I had cash in my bank to buy the car. And then the advice is not to pay the car in cash, but to finance the car in order to build up your credit score, right? So you take more debt in order to show that you're more debt worthy, so credit worthy. So it's these kinds of things that you think, what is this? But that's life, I guess, in order to get a credit score. Yeah.
Thank you. And always have your checkbook at hand as well.
Oh yeah, yes. I have it here. Yeah.
Very good. Yeah.
Yeah. I had to check how to write checks again. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think we have time for one more question that was sent in from registrant, more of a general question. Maybe Sophie or Bart can answer those. Question from Andy. He asked me, is there a network of trusted local market representation agents or distributors who represent overseas technologies in the USA? So I think it's a very, kind of general, not easy to answer question, but what would be a good way for Andy to go about all of that?
It depends. You have to do your research and see in which industry you are. There are a lot of industry organizations here. It really depends in which industry you're operating, and then yes, do your research and see which organization can help you. And then there's also trade organizations specifically for certain countries. For Belgium, for example, I'm thinking about Flanders Investment and Trade, but there's also Belgian companies that can, organization like this that can help you. So it really depends on what you're looking for and which industry you're operating.
Yes, if I may add to that, the Consulate-General may help out in that sense. We do not have all the agents ready in our system, but we can help looking for them. And indeed, as Sophie said, it depends a little bit on what you're specifically really looking for. So therefore, we do invite Andy to get in direct contact with our economic department, and from there we can see where we can help him.
Okay, thank you.
Perhaps I should also say that the chambers of commerce in the Netherlands, for instance, are mandatory organizations where you need to register and submit your tax file or your filings, your reports. In the US, it's much more a networking organization. And I would say contact your local chamber, whether that's the Belgium or whether that's the Dutch chamber in Chicago or in Atlanta. There are bilateral organizations, and they may not have lists, but the networks that they represent can definitely help you.
Thank you, everyone, for this very interesting webinar. Thank you, all speakers. Thank you, Bart, Ben, Jacob, Sophie, Jeroen, and Ryan. And thank you, of course, to all attendees. We will send out the recording later today, and we hope to see you soon at one of our next events. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.